It is now the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Tibet Autonomous Region in China. I know a good deal about China, but until very recently, I did not know this. Actually, I don't know much about Tibet, other than common knowledge facts. Tibet is one of the most sensitive issues in China. The Chinese people, not only the Chinese leaders, assert that Tibet is an inalienable part of China. Westerners, on the other hand, assume that China used force to incorporate Tibet into China and uses force to control Tibet, suppressing Tibetan religion and culture. I am familiar with Western views. I should get familiar with Chinese views to get closer to China.
To celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Tibet Autonomous Region, a grand ceremony was held in front of the Potala Palace in Lhasa, Tibet's capital city. The Tibet Autonomous Region was founded on September 1st, 1965, and during the past 50 years, according to the Chinese government, it has not only achieved significant economic development, but also has implemented the system of regional ethnic autonomy, which includes culture, education, and the like.
When people in the West hear that China claims to have done a peaceful liberation of Tibet, 1950, 1951, it always sounds like a dark joke because it wasn't peaceful because you needed an army. Why does China use that phrase, peaceful liberation?
我们说西藏自古是中国的一部分，那是从历史
We say that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times. That is because, seen from the historical perspectives, the history of Tibet comprises a part of China's history. And from the perspective of nationality, there are several dozens of ethnic minorities in China, and Tibetan is one of them. However, administrative territory is a modern concept that is applied to modern countries in the international community. It is inappropriate to judge the status of Tibet in this perspective.
产生了现代国家这个概念的时候，那我们开始接受了西方的这些观念，用西方的标准来衡量、来判定。那么这里面就有一个问题，就是说西藏它的历史，中国西藏的历史非常。
Tibet as a region and Tibetan as an ethnic minority has a long and profound history, and so does China. Recorded Chinese history is as long as 5,000 years. Throughout its long history, the central government of different dynasties adopted different governance systems.
According to official Chinese statements, prior to 1950, Tibet was ruled by the former Kuomintang government. At the end of 1949, after liberating major parts of South and Southwest China in the Civil War, the Chinese People's Liberation Army prepared to enter Tibet. Considering Tibet's specific situation, China's then central government requested that Tibet's authorities send representatives to Beijing for negotiating Tibet's peaceful liberation. However, the negotiations failed. On October the 19th, 1950, the PLA took over Kwamdel, the gateway to Tibet, annihilating the former Tibetan force of 5,700. In April 1951, Tibet authorities sent a 5-member delegation to Beijing to negotiate with representatives of the central government. After several rounds of consultations, the two sides signed an agreement entitled Measures for the Peaceful Liberation of Tibet, 17-article agreement for short, on May the 23rd, thus declaring the peaceful liberation of Tibet. According to the agreement, the Tibetan people have the right of exercising national autonomy under the unified leadership of the Central People's Government. The central authorities will not alter the existing political system in Tibet. The freedom of religious belief in Tibet is guaranteed.
西藏地方呢，它是同意派出代表，达赖喇嘛他是他。
As a matter of fact, upon the signing of the 17-article agreement, representatives from Tibet, including the representative of the Dalai Lama, were sent to Beijing to sign the agreement. After the 17-article agreement was signed, the hard copy was brought to Lhasa, and it was in compliance with legal procedure. The story is much more than just a telegram from the Dalai Lama to Chairman Mao Zedong on October 24, 1951. The agreement was a result of negotiation of all key officials from the Tibet local government. After they reached a consensus, the Dalai Lama sent a telegram to the central government, including representatives from Gandane, Sera, and Driphan monasteries. After the meeting, they came up with the final resolution, stamped their seals, and sent it to the Dalai Lama, who then sent a telegram to the central government. The story was very clear. We say we liberated Nanjing, all other provinces like Hainan in China, and even we're going to liberate Taiwan. But only when we use it for Tibet, and when we say liberate Tibet, will people find it hard to understand. This also reflects the complexity and unusual nature of this problem. It involves the attitude of the international society. We say the People's Liberation Army liberated Tibet for a historical reason. As Tibet is a part of China, it is reasonable to say the PLA liberated Tibet. To sum up, I think the reason why some people cannot accept the phrase peaceful liberation is mainly due to the lack of thorough research and the lack of dissemination of information.
Tibet, the roof of the world, where tradition meets modernity, nature's wonder, development and change, respect for the past, embracing the future. The Tibet Autonomous Region marks its 50th anniversary in September. Join us then, only on CCTV News.
Many people would hope that the Dalai Lama can be reconciled with China, particularly before, as an old man, he would die, because if he dies without reconciliation, there may be more fragmentation of certain Tibetan groups who could become more radicalized, more extreme. From your understanding of the history of the Dalai Lama meeting with Chinese leaders, what advice would you have to both sides to try to find a reconciliation?
最早，达赖喇嘛在这个1959年离开西藏到印度之后，大约有20年的时间，跟中央政府之间是没有接触，也没有。
After the Dalai Lama left Tibet and went to India in 1959, he did not communicate with the Chinese central government for about 20 years. In 1979, Mr. Deng Xiaoping talked with Associated Press journalists and said that the Dalai Lama could contact the central government. And as long as he acknowledged that he was a Chinese citizen and Tibet was a part of China, we could discuss any question.
那么在邓小平先生的这样的一个倡导之下，中央政府开始跟达赖喇嘛之间有了这个初步的接触。
With Mr. Deng's advocacy, the central government began its primary contact with the Dalai Lama. The central government has always been active in talking with the Dalai Lama, yet remained firm on its basic principles. From the end of the 1970s to now, the principles and stances of the Chinese government have remained unchanged.
那么这个原则和立场，在这个70年代末到至今是没有变化的。但是达赖喇嘛却在不同的历史。
But in different historical periods, the Dalai Lama's attitude has always been changing. When the international and domestic situations were, or seemed to be, in his favor, he ended his talks with the Chinese government. However, if circumstances, including those in Tibet, were the other way around, then he would like to restart the talks. But even when the talks were going on, the so-called Government of Tibet in Exile, or now the Central Tibetan Administration, was interfering in and disrupting domestic affairs in Tibet.
始终没有放弃对国内藏区的这样的一些个干扰和破坏活动。那么到了2010年
，In 2010, the Dalai Lama announced that he would take political retirement, after which he would no longer be the political leader of the government in exile or the Central Tibetan Administration. Instead, he was going to retire from the politics and focus on religious activities.
在此之后，这一段时间也差不多有5年了，中央政府一直没有再跟他进行接触商谈。为什么呢？他这个藏人行政中央
Since then, all talks
对
stopped.
司政领导。
Now it is impossible for the central government to talk with the so-called incumbent leader of the Central Tibetan Administration, in that the Chinese government has never acknowledged the legitimacy of the Dalai Lama's government in exile, or the so-called Central Tibetan Administration.
达赖喇嘛的流亡政府也没有承认过这个所谓的藏人行政中央，所以不可能让他们 作为这个所谓的中央或者是所谓的政府来跟中国的中央政府进行接触商谈，因此这个才搁置到现在。
So in no way can this so-called Tibetan government have any talks with the Chinese government. That's why all things have come to a halt in recent years.
而是在
In fact, the Chinese government does not refuse to talk with the Dalai Lama. Quite the contrary, it is people around him, his advisors and his Western supporters, who are creating obstacles.
甚至包括一些个这个西方的一些个所谓的这个帮助他、支持他的一些个人。因此呢，我觉得达赖喇嘛要想真正的叶落归根。
So I think the Dalai Lama must abandon all his illusions and wrong ideas. Only by which can he return to his hometown and make contributions as the living Buddha of Gerlach to Tibet and his religious sect.
这个排除一切干扰，排除他周围的各种各样的干扰。那么他能不能做到这一点呢？ 我甚至觉得也有一定的难度。
I think this is difficult for the Dalai Lama and other Tibetans who are in exile overseas to do. Over the years, they have been somewhat co-opted and manipulated by some foreign forces, including the US. So sometimes they are serving as bargaining chips in Sino-US relations.
包括美国，我觉得有的时候是在跟中美关系当中，这个都是一个筹码。
We're also coming up on the 50th anniversary of another event, which is the 50th anniversary of the establishment of what's called in China the Tibet Autonomous Region, which came, I don't know, 5-6 years after China did what it calls the peaceful liberation of Tibet, which obviously has different interpretations in the West and around the world. How do you look at this period of time for Tibet as a historian and dealing with the realisms of today's world?
I think, again, if you look at the Tibet question from the perspective of history, you will get into endless discussions and arguments. If you look at it from the perspective of the interest of China, I think you would have to say the dilemma of Beijing's relationship to Tibet is pretty high up on the list of those issues which makes other nations feel uncomfortable. So what's the solution? I think we've reached a point where most people agree that Tibetan independence is not likely and probably is not what only a very few people, I think, are still in support of it, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So again, I mean, I hate to sound like some silly idealist just filled with crazy ideas that will never happen, but it seems to me that there is a way forward on Tibet that would be most profitable for the Chinese leadership to take, namely to try to reassure greater cultural autonomy of Tibet, Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan culture, Tibetan ethnic people, their way of life. Also to make some sort of gesture towards the Dalai Lama. When he dies, and he's what, 80? There isn't going to be anybody who really can help control the situation. And I think that while he is alive, he is a man of sufficient reason and principle that Beijing could profitably use him. I don't like to use the word use, but could go into partnership with him to calm things down. Reassure the people of Tibet, yes, you're part of China. Yes, we want you to have a maximum level of autonomy, and to work out some new arrangements that make everybody feel more comfortable.
如果他在有生之年能做，那最好。如果做不好，假如他有
If he can reconcile with the central government before death, that would be the best scenario. But if not, if he passes away without reconciliation, I also think the problem will not be so bad as to produce riots. There might be some provocation with irrational behavior, but it won't be beyond control. From 1959 to 1969, there had been local insurgencies in Tibet. During that total of 10 years, they organized armed riots, assassinating the leaders as well as the civilians. So what they are capable of now can never go more than what they did during that period of time. And at present, the whole international community is calling for peace and stability. So armed insurgency or riots are against this world trend.
What is the responsibility of countries? There are many in China, officials to whom I speak, say that what we've done for Tibet has been such a liberation in terms of the people's spirits, in terms of getting out from under their system and giving them, all the roads and electricity and educational opportunities. And so how do you balance the two?
I think there's no doubt that the amount of investment that China, central China, has put into the Tibetan, not just the autonomous region, but the border regions, has been substantial, and the quality of life is greatly improved. I think where there is a challenge still is on the side of culture and religion. Yes, Tibet was a very superstitious, even feudal society with serfs and a system of landowning and theocracy, indeed. The challenge, though, is to try to modernize the country, or the place, the region, without sort of destroying the spiritual aspect that is in no place in the world is it sort of more deeply rooted than in Tibet, in my experience. So I think it can be done. And the part that the Chinese have done very well is the infrastructure, the roads, the trains, airports, schools, healthcare, things like that. The part that still needs some work is how do you shield and protect this very unique culture and religion. And I don't think it's a contradiction. I think you can do it. And I think the best way to do it is to sort of heal that historical wound between the exiles and the people who remain in Tibet. I think it can be done.
what is China doing to protect and to nourish Tibetan Buddhism?
我们要这个科学的来理解呢，这个保护与发展的关系。
We need to understand the relationship between protection and development with a scientific viewpoint. Each culture needs to connect to the world civilization and requires both protection and development. For the Tibetan ethnic group, they need to preserve their own traditional culture and meanwhile share the achievements of human civilization. So both culture and civilization are dynamic and require both protection and development. If we think a certain kind of culture is static and remains unchanged, or protect the culture by cutting it off from other cultures, then we will be wrong. Each ethnic group needs its own traditional culture and shares the fruits of human civilization. From this perspective, the protection and development of culture should not be closed or conservative.
在藏传佛教的这个保护与发展上呢，确实是呢，中国政府呢，一是尊重藏传。
As for the protection and development of Tibetan Buddhism, the Chinese government respects Tibetan Buddhism and implements the policy of freedom of religious belief. I told you there are about 150,000 monks in Tibetan inhabited regions. This shows that we have freedom of religious belief. Members of religious communities can preach and carry out religious activities according to the situation of their religion. Religious people are also free to take part in religious activities, make pilgrims to holy mountains, or make offerings. Temples, murals, and arts related to religious culture have been well preserved. Among the Tibetan inhabited regions, Tibet alone has more than 1,700 temples with a large amount of religious artworks. This shows that the religious culture has been well protected.
1700多座寺庙，那它保留了大量的宗教艺术品。 这个文化保护的成就是很大的。
Today's world, the assumptions are that China has an oppressive control of Tibet, that the Tibetan people are under pressure in their culture, their religion, their territory has been incorporated into China. Do you find that a common perception in the West?
在当前社会当中，实际上每一个民族 都面临着一个传统和现代化的这样的一种有矛盾，有矛盾。
In the current society, every ethnic group is faced with a conflict between tradition and modernization. How to handle this conflict is a problem that every ethnic group must face. It is the same for Tibet.
不能够回避的问题。那么西藏 同样是这样，那为什么西藏的传统和现代化，它的矛盾看起来就更加的这种激烈或者冲突？
Why does this conflict between tradition and modernization look more intense in Tibet?
它在半个多世纪
Because half a century ago, before the democratic reform in 1959, Tibet was at a social stage with a theocratic feudal serfdom system.
是一个政教合一的
At the social stage, the so-called traditional culture included an important part, the religious culture. The religious culture had influenced this ethnic group for several hundred years, or even longer. If we try to modernize such a society in one stride, the conflict would be much more intense.
那么要想在这样的一种这个几百年的影响 过程当中，一下子跨入到这个现代化这样的社会阶段，它的矛盾就会非常的激烈，冲突就会更多。那么面对这个呢，其实我们是采取了很多这个必要的。
In view of this, we have taken many necessary measures to protect the traditional culture and make equal progress in the modernization of Tibet. This is not easy, but we are making full efforts.
能够发展，能够进步，这一点很难，但是呢，是积极在做的。我也跟很多藏族的这个包括干部啊和这个专家学者都有过接触，
I have also communicated with Tibetan cadres, scholars, and experts. They themselves sometimes also feel confused about the conflict between tradition and modernization. For example, the use of the Tibetan language. Both the Constitution and the law on regional ethnic autonomy stipulate that Tibetan people learn and use their ethnic language. But there are many Tibetan pupils who begin to learn Mandarin or even English at an early age. Why? Because they must seek more opportunities for development in this society. If a Tibetan child only learns Tibetan at school, his activities would be limited to Tibet alone, and he would have fewer opportunities for development. Therefore, many Tibetan people hope that their children can learn Mandarin and English to expand their horizons and go to other places in China and the world for further development.
他们很多人还是愿意自己的孩子从小就学习汉语、学习英语，希望将来能够视野更宽一点，能够到内地来，或者是到国外去发展。
In the Donghuamen community of Beijing, near the Forbidden City, there are always activities to teach the residents on garbage classification. The Tibetan lady Yongju Siji is the one who has been working on publicity and administration for years. Yongju moved to Beijing in 2002 because her husband had a better job opportunity.
To
be honest, I found it hard to get adapted when I first came. I grew up in a sparsely populated area where there are much fewer cars on the road. I even remember that we kids would call up our friends to watch the car whenever there is one passing by. But in Beijing, I was overwhelmed by the many people and cars, really not used to it.
Over the past years, Yongju has learned that it's equally important to inherit the traditional Tibetan culture and to keep an open mind for other cultures, an attitude that could create more opportunities in contemporary society. So she pays a good deal of attention to teaching her son how to keep Tibetan culture and other cultures in balance.
When he got to Beijing at 3, he couldn't speak any Mandarin, all but the Tibetan language. Then after a time in the kindergarten, he barely spoke any Tibetan anymore. Now he has no problem with listening, but already lost the ability to speak complicated sentences in Tibetan. However, I ask him to go to Tibet every vacation, as I want him to learn both languages.
Tibet divides China and the West, though Tibet is far more important to China than it is to the West. No one doubts that Tibet is among China's core interests, touching China's nerve of sovereignty, made supersensitive by a century of foreign oppression and humiliation. At a recent national conference on Tibet, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the Tibet Autonomous Region, all 7 of China's senior leaders attended. In addressing the group, President Xi Jinping stressed ensuring national unity and consolidating ethnic unity in Tibet and realizing long-term and comprehensive social stability as an obligatory task. He called for firmly taking the initiative in the fight against separatism, and he promised to promote economic growth with continued preferential policies. China certainly allocates a higher share of resources to Tibet, but to ask, what more can China do to respect Tibetan culture, religion, tradition, and pride is a legitimate question. There is more to be said about Tibet to get closer to China.